Thank you. So I want to take you back about 5 years. I just hung up my phone and I'd come off a phone call with Nick Soros. Now, some of you in the room will know Nick Soros, I know, because he's been involved in DataKind. And he and I had just decided that we were going to start Mantis. And Mantis is our consultancy. We've been running it for about 5 years. And we were really excited at the time because, well, it kind of looked like this AI thing, right, was going to be popular, right? And we'd sort of been working on natural language processing for about 5 years each. And we were like, okay, maybe there's something in this. Maybe we should start a company. And putting my phone down, I was in my living room in Santiago de Chile, which is where I lived at the time. I can tell you the things that were not on my mind. They were not, how am I going to manage a team? They were not, what are all the leadership challenges which are going to come up over the next 5 years? They were like, oh, great, I'm going to do some cool AI projects. Maybe we're going to exit and make loads of money or something. But these things were not really on my mind. They now are on my mind. But I'm aware that a lot of people come to sort of leadership, and I'm sort of conflating management and leadership a bit here. I'll explain a bit about that later. A lot of people come to leadership positions a bit like this, where at some point you arrive at a kind of moment, like an impasse in your career, where you kind of have to make a decision and say, well, okay, I can either continue as an individual contributor and stay really, really deeply technical, or I can take on more management responsibility and all of the things that entails. And I mean, this is a generalization. There are, of course, individual contributors who also do management and vice versa. But I think this is a fairly common thing that happens. And so this talk is really about the six errors or six issues that have come up for me over the last 5 years in this sort of process of going from someone who mostly writes code to someone who mostly writes emails. And this is a very personal thing. I mean, calling them errors is possibly a bit mean because I think these are things that just happen, and these are things that happen to me. So other opinions are out there, but let's go from here. So just to give you a little bit of my background, so this is Nick and I, both looking very naive and happy 5 years ago. We started Mantis, and so I've sort of been co-founder with him for about the last 4 or 5 years. Before that, I was a freelancer, and then before that, I had some other sort of data science posts in different places, like the Government Digital Service, the Department for Education, and then I was in academia before that. And then the red herring at the bottom is I actually had a previous career before I worked in data science, which was teaching bushcraft, which is quite a bit of a strange transition to make, but there's lots of parallels when you start to think about things like management and leadership. And if I kind of try and break down like my responsibilities over the last few years in these kind of broad 2 buckets, I went from having like loads of leadership when I was sort of doing bushcraft, because we were sort of taking groups of 30 people out into the wild and trying to keep them alive and not cutting their toes off and that kind of thing, and keeping them inspired when it was really rainy in the English Lake District. And then I went to academia and I kind of had no management responsibilities at all, or maybe managing a couple of students and stuff. So it was kind of pretty more relaxed. And that sort of gradually built up over time until I became a freelancer again, and I kind of let go of all of that. And then all of a sudden, I sort of switched and did the complete opposite. So now I'm in Mantis, one of the 2 founders, and I have quite a lot of this kind of management leadership responsibility. And just in case you don't believe me about the bushcraft stuff, this is me about 18 years ago, in the Atavi Mountains in Namibia, having just done 2 weeks with a load of our clients in the bush. So let's start talking about these errors. So error number 1, assertion error. Let's get the big one out of the way, imposter syndrome. So I suffer massively from imposter syndrome. I think that the kind of people that are attracted to engineering often are the kind of people who are going to suffer from this, right? Because we're sort of quite analytical. We make an assessment of our own capabilities and think, well, maybe there's people who know more about this than I do. And that's a thing. So I think when you go from a technical position into a leadership position, you kind of end up often in this sort of place where you're kind of half expected to be technical, but then you've also got all this leadership responsibility, and you're not really technical enough to anymore, like you're not hands-on enough on the code to kind of understand how all the models work and how exactly everything works. But on the other end, you're supposed to be taking on all of these new leadership sort of capabilities, and you've never done that before, so that's kind of stressful. So you're like, well, I don't really know how to do that either. So you're kind of stuck in this perfect storm of imposter syndrome. You feel like a fraud because you don't really know how to do either anymore. And just to say, I mean, that is perfectly normal. And I think I want to give you some examples of things that I feel a fraud about. So number one is this. So in 2021, my GitHub graph looked like a pleasant green meadow. Now it looks like a barren gray wasteland. And most of those green dots are actually from CI/CD, so they're not even real contributions. So that's one. There's another thing, imposter syndrome in action, and this is very meta. So I'm right now experiencing significant imposter syndrome because I am talking to a room of people about imposter syndrome and leadership. And I run a company of what's about 5 people now in this workshop, leadership workshop that we had before. I was talking to people who have teams of 20. I'm sure people have bigger teams. So I'm a fraud. I don't know what I'm talking about, but hopefully by the end of this talk, you will have got some value from that at least. I don't think there's any silver bullet for imposter syndrome, but there are some things that help. So number one for me is talking to people, coming to conferences, having conversations with people about things like imposter syndrome, getting to understand how other people feel about my capabilities, getting honest feedback that actually, no, you do seem to know a little bit about this sometimes. Something that helps me a lot is to ask this question, okay, what would have happened if I hadn't been here? Sometimes I think in my company, I'm only doing this, I'm only managing this because there's no one else who really wants to do it. And sometimes it helps to say, okay, but if I wasn't here, like who's going to pick up the slack? And would they be able to do the job the way I've done it? And maybe I'm the best person to do this job right now. And I think on the question of this sort of technical transition from technical to leadership, I think it's worth remembering that change is not irreversible. So if at some point you decide, look, actually, this leadership thing is not really for me, I would much rather be an independent contributor, well, you can do that. And it's never going to be as hard to learn all of that technical stuff as it was the first time you learned it, not least because now we have AI. So things, you can ask ChatGPT why your code isn't working, and maybe it'll tell you, maybe not. So that's something I think about that, okay, maybe in a couple of years I'll decide I don't want to do this anymore. And it's okay. You can become an individual contributor. You can go back to being fully technical. So number 2, deadlock error, unable to release control. So I'm really talking about delegation. And now this is an error on my side. So I suck at delegation. I really, really suck at it. And I think the way this manifests for me is when I'm working with people who aren't engineers. And we're sort of used to working in a very regulated way, in a way. You write issues, you create pull requests, you do reviews. That's normal for us. That's not necessarily normal for salespeople. They're not used to having every single little bit of their work, picked apart in a sort of pull review kind of method. And you have to kind of come to the conclusion that actually maybe that's not the most appropriate way to deal with people working with you. When they're writing emails to send out to clients, you don't need to review every single one. And my lesson has been, look, just get out of the way. Get out of the way, let these people do these things that they're the expert in. Why am I even reading your email? Like, I shouldn't be doing that. So you deal with it, you're the expert. And it sounds very simple, but sometimes it can be a little bit difficult. And part of that is because of this sort of whole perfectionist sort of side of things that I have a problem with. I'm very much a perfectionist. I'm sure a lot of you in the room manifest this sort of perfectionism. And that really doesn't scale as you start to work in a larger and larger organization. You simply cannot express your perfectionism on every little task, and it's probably not perfect anyway. And I guess the final thing I'd say, so this is really thinking back to when I used to work in bushcraft, and I used to have people who worked under me in my team, is sometimes I would find myself not wanting to give the crap jobs to, no pun intended, to other people, because I felt like it made me look like a bad leader if I was saying, hey, you go and, new guy, you go and dig the latrine. I was kind of like, oh no, I'm going to go and dig the latrine because I feel a bit mean for making this guy dig the latrine because it's a pretty crappy job. But actually, that's fine. Sometimes you do need to delegate crappy tasks because you're in a leadership role. Other people need to kind of do those jobs sometimes, and that's something you have to accept. And it doesn't make you a bad leader if you ask other people to do crap jobs sometimes. Okay, number 3. So key error, culture not defined. So I actually think this is something that we as a company do quite well. But I've certainly been in companies where there have been issues with the culture. And I think there's 3 things I want to say about culture. This is on the right-hand side. This is from our website. You won't be able to read it, but this is from the Mantis website. And we have been very, very deliberate about stating what we think our culture should be as a company. We've actually just redone this, so there's a new version that's going to come out soon. But from the very beginning, me and Nick, we kind of were like, okay, these are these 6 things that we think are important. Let's put them on our website, and let's make it really clear what these things we believe are. And we were kind of motivated by a number of other companies. So I don't know if anyone in the room knows Public Digital. It's a consultancy, digital consultancy. They do a really nice job of this by setting their position statements out. That was a real inspiration. And even companies like GSK. So GSK does a really good job of this. I can't remember exactly what their 3 statements are, but there's 3 of them. It's really simple, and they get their sort of culture defined in a really simplistic way. I think as a leader, one of the things that I'm acutely aware of is that good culture is very difficult to build, but extremely easy to lose. And it sort of flows down from the top. And I've been in organizations before where I sort of joined and it was like, oh great, this is a really cool place. And then you would find some of the leaders were kind of getting a bit tied up in their day jobs or in getting in the next round of funding. And it's really easy for them to let that sort of culture, the good quality culture of the organization to slip. So I guess this is just a reminder to say, look, it flows down from the top. And even though you're busy, you still need to spend some time maintaining that company culture and working on it. It's not necessarily a thing which will exist on its own if you don't put some effort in to maintain it. And I think my biggest lesson recently, so we had the things that have been going on in the States with the political changes have rolled down to us. And recently we had a bit of a hard time. We had to let some people go. And that is extremely difficult from a leadership position, letting go people, especially when you don't want to let them go. You want to keep hold of them, but because of circumstances outside of your control, you have to let them go. And one of the really nice pieces of feedback I had after that was that the way we had approached those redundancies was really honest and transparent. And I think that was, for me, like a validation that the way that we'd approached our culture, even under the most difficult circumstances, had actually sort of shone through and been, it came through at that really difficult time. There's much more I could say about this, but the main thing I'll say is check out Boss Class from The Economist. I don't know, does anyone know Boss Class? Very good. So this is a podcast about management from The Economist. You have to pay to listen to it, but it's like €5 a month or something like that. So worth listening to. And they cover a whole range of topics which are super useful for people in leadership roles. So number 4. Connection error, signal not received. So I guess what I'm talking about here really is the importance of communication when you are in leadership roles. And it becomes super critical because you sort of move to a situation. And so, I mean, Mantis is a consultancy, right? So we speak to other companies. Sometimes I'm in conversations with CEOs. Sometimes I'm talking to investors. Sometimes I'm talking to potential new employees. Sometimes I'm talking to existing employees. Sometimes I'm talking to our competitors. You suddenly have a very wide range of people that you're talking to, which, by the way, is one of the best things about starting a company. You kind of get this access which you sort of didn't get before, and you get this kind of cross-section across the industry, which is very cool. But it does mean that essentially the most important skill, I think, that you can cultivate is good communication skills. For you to be able to have these conversations and to sort of execute on them well. And not everyone, these are not learned, these are not innate skills that everybody has. These are skills you can learn. So over the last 4 or 5 years, what thing I've been trying to sort of skill up on most is my communication skills. And I wanted to recommend a couple of books to you. So the first of them is Never Split the Difference. Has anyone read this? One person, John, he's my cheerleader over there. So Never Split the Difference is written by this guy called Chris Voss, who was a negotiator for the FBI. And essentially his job was to kind of go around the world and negotiate on behalf of the US government during hostage situations and other difficult negotiations. And he sort of came away and he set up his own company and he wrote this book. And I think this is probably the most life-changing book I've ever read. I've read it sort of twice. I sort of try and read it with some regularity because I start to forget the lessons, but it's really, really worth a read. And my sort of key takeaway from this book is, number one, that pretty much everything is negotiation, whether you realize it or not. And there's some really obvious negotiations that happen in your life, like when you're negotiating for a salary change or you're negotiating on a contract or whatever. But actually, sometimes you're negotiating with your kids to get them to go to bed on time, or you're negotiating with your partner because you want to go cycling and they want to go and do something else. So these are all negotiations that happen throughout our daily lives. And it's good to recognize that fact. And the second thing is that he talks about, and I hate this phrase, but he calls it tactical empathy, which sounds like an incredibly Machiavellian sort of way of describing it. But it's essentially active listening. It's essentially making or doing a number of techniques to allow the partner in your conversation to feel like you're really listening to them and you are really listening to them and you're taking on board everything they're saying. And there's a couple of techniques in this book that you can read about that I'm not going to go through all of them, but one of them I will mention is labeling. Sometimes this is also called looping for confirmation. And that basically is, say I'm having a conversation with someone and they're telling me, we've got this problem with production and all the tests are failing or something. What I'll do is then basically take what they've said, rehash it in my own words, and then speak it back to them. And then perhaps even ask for confirmation. Say, is that right? And you're kind of looking for them to respond to you. Yeah, that's it. That's right. You got it. And it's so simple, but it's an incredibly effective way of communicating to someone. Look, I heard what you said. I've rehashed it in my own words, and now I'm playing it back to you. And we use this with clients like all the time. So it normally begins with a sentence like, it sounds like, or it looks like. And by approaching it in that way, you can kind of be a bit less confrontational sometimes when you're labeling something which is a bit problematic, like an emotion or something like that. But anyway, read the book. It's absolutely awesome. So the other book I really want to recommend is Super Communicators by Charles Duhigg. And I think the two takeaways I want to sort of share from this book. One, vulnerability is a superpower. So I'm here right now being a little bit vulnerable with you guys, telling you, okay, these are all the mistakes I've made. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm a massive fraud. And hopefully that engenders a little bit of connection with you. But what this book kind of shows you is that sometimes by offering a little bit of your own vulnerability in conversation and even negotiation, you allow yourself to create a connection with the other side. And that can be really helpful when you're trying to communicate for various reasons. The other good takeaway from this book, which really landed with me, is that often there's some research that kind of shows that we're often having only one of three conversations. And those conversations are either practical, like let's find a solution, like production's broken again, let's fix it, or emotional, someone is looking for your support, or just social, maybe we're just talking about what we did at the weekend, and that's kind of about us building our relationship and understanding where we are in relation to each other. And sometimes you can end up having the wrong conversation with someone. And I've noticed this with my wife. It used to happen until we both read this book. And basically what would happen is I would come home from work and I'd be like, I just had this day, like production's broken again, like it really sucks, and so said this. And she'd be like, well, maybe you could think about doing it this way, or have you thought about doing that? And I'd be like, no, but you're not listening to me. Like, and essentially what was happening is we're having these two different conversations. I was having an emotional conversation where I was saying, oh, everything sucks. I just need you to give me a hug and support me. And she was having a practical conversation where she was going, no, but these are some ideas that you can use to resolve your problem. And once we realized that we were having these kind of this mismatched conversation, it became, it helped our relationship a lot because we weren't then having an argument and me going, oh, you don't understand me, and storming off. So anyway, another great read, and I think there's a lot of useful information in there for a business kind of point of view. So number 5, I'm flying through. Type error, instant gratification is not callable. So I have this thesis that, I don't know if you've heard of this idea of delayed gratification. So you unlock your phone, and sometimes there's this little bit of a pause before you kind of seeing an icon appear. You're unlocking your phone, or you're opening an app, and then suddenly, ding, you get a notification that says, okay, I've got like 5 messages, or someone tweeted me, or something like that. And that kind of little delayed sort of moment, that fraction of a second, is enough to generate this kind of dopamine hit in your brain. And your brain, it's very addictive. That's why kids get one of the reasons why kids get very addicted to phones. Now, I have this theory that the command line is basically the same as that. You write in a command, and then there's this sort of moment of anticipation. Is it going to work? Is it not going to work? And then bang, it works. And you're like, oh, great, I'll send another command. And it's the same with tests. You're running a test, and it's like, oh, I run my tests. They're going to pass. Oh, they failed. Oh, try again. And then you get this kind of hit, and you're like, great, I feel good. And I feel like programming, for me, used to be a bit like that, where I was constantly getting this hit of dopamine. And even to the point where I'd find, like, when I'm programming, I don't feel the need to exercise that much. It's almost as if the buzz I get from exercising is overtaken by the buzz I get from programming. So now I don't program so much, and I exercise a lot more, and it's kind of a lot more healthy. So this is kind of how I think about this when you take on more leadership responsibility. I think you go from the situation where you're getting this very quick sort of dopamine hit of like passing tests, sending commands in the command line, this kind of gamification of, oh, I merged a pull request, oh, I fixed this issue, great, to then moving towards kind of these kind of longer term things, which actually don't give you a lot of gratification for a really long time. So, in our line of work, like let's say we want to onboard a new client, we have an initial sales conversation with a client. We might not actually sign a contract with that client and do any work with them for 3 months, maybe 6 months. We might have 5 conversations in between us talking to them and starting some work. And so the gratification is super delayed. It takes a really, really long time. And that's true in companies as well, when you're trying to get buy-in for projects, or you're trying to deliver value in a product. And in the long term, the really long term, relationships take really, really long time to build. A really good relationship takes years. And that's ultimately what you tend to be doing when you move into kind of more of these senior roles. You're building relationships within your organization and outside of your organization. So I guess the point is that you kind of have to shift a little bit your sort of mentality on how you're going to be rewarded. You're not going to get these dopamine hits every single day or every hour. You need to kind of shift your mentality a little bit and be aware that actually your gratification is going to come a little bit down the line. And that's a little bit of a learning and a slightly painful process to go through. How am I doing? Okay, so the last one. I'm going to take a drink because this is the big one. So runtime error, system overload. So I know some of you were in the leadership workshop earlier, and we talked about overload. And I think this is the biggest topic, and it's certainly the one that affects me the most. And when we started our company Mantis, like we really wanted to make it a really good place to work in terms of people's mental health. And even with that kind of, even setting out like that, both me and the founder, the other founder, have found times when it's actually really, really stressful, and you feel a little bit overloaded. And I think sometimes it feels a bit like this. It's like, great, oh, you got a new job, now you're on fire, and everything's a bit painful. And and the key thing I think for me of this image is that this bear or dog or whatever it is alone. It's absolutely alone, sitting in the middle of the fire. And that I think is one of the things which makes leadership roles a little bit stressful is that it can be difficult to talk about, you are kind of isolated. There's maybe no one quite at your level. There's people above you, there's people underneath you, and it can be difficult to have the conversations about exactly the kind of difficulties you're experiencing. So it becomes a bit isolating. And I think the way really to tackle that is, well, try not to do it alone. So I know Ian earlier on was talking about his Rebel AI group, and he plugged me earlier, so I'm going to plug him now. Getting a group of peers who you can talk to about these challenges is super important. And maybe they're in your organization, maybe they're outside of your organization. For us as a startup, something that's been incredibly useful is getting advisors and mentors, people who have done what we're doing before. That's been an incredible multiplier for us and a real stress reducer, because they can go, oh no, yeah, you're on the right track, or maybe you're not on the right track. And I think the second one really is fundamental. Prioritize your well-being, but don't do it for yourself. Do it for everybody else around you, because the people who are going to suffer if you're not prioritizing your well-being are your family, your kids, your co-workers. So if you're not going to do it for yourself, and we should do it for ourselves, think about everyone else, because everyone's going to suffer if you start being a super stressed out leader and you start leaning on people and being grumpy with them. And I think the other thing about this is that every time I get super stressed, the first thing I do is go, oh, I'm too busy to go running. Oh, I'm too busy to go to yoga. I'm too busy to, classic founder things. I'm too busy to do all these things which actually are my traditional coping mechanisms. And that's completely the wrong way of thinking about it. I should be like, I am super stressed, I have to go running. I need to make sure I go out there and do these things, these self-coping mechanisms, which are actually going to reduce my stress. And I think it's really common that we do that the wrong way around. So that's been a hard learning for me. Movement makes the change in your mentality sometimes. And probably the most important thing that I'd like people to take away from this talk is that therapy is incredibly important. It's like a prophylactic. Don't start doing therapy when you feel really stressed. Start tomorrow. There's no shame in doing therapy. Get a therapist. There's applications out there you can use to find online therapists if you want, or you can find a therapist locally, whatever works for you. But there are many, many opportunities to speak to therapists, and there are thousands of different types of therapists. But I really encourage everybody, do some therapy. And I wish I had done therapy 20 years ago, because now I look back on my life and I go, oh man, I made that bad decision when I was like 21, and I did it because I was suffering from anxiety, or I had this issue which I've only just discovered at the age of 42. And it's like, man, why did no one give me that advice sooner? So there is no, I don't know who needs to hear this in this room, but there is no shame in doing therapy. It is a highly, highly important thing to do, and I really encourage you all to do it. And I'm sort of coming up to time. So the final thing I'd like to say is that mindset matters more than you think when thinking about stress and overload, burnout, and these difficult situations. And there's actually quite a lot of evidence to sort of back this up. So there's this idea that if you approach stress in a way that says, okay, it's really debilitating and it's really difficult for me and it affects me really badly, then it will affect you really badly. And if you actually try and change the sort of rubric and the way you think about stress to being like, okay, this is tough, I'm going to get through this, and the next time I come up with this situation, I'm going to do better because I've been through this once before, and I know what it's like. And this is this kind of stress is enhancing mindset. If you're able to adopt this stress is enhancing mindset, then actually all of those symptoms of stress, that we normally experience, they get reduced. And this is not a silver bullet. It's not going to fix everything, but it is worth bearing in mind. And it's certainly the way I try to think about these challenges when you wake up in the morning and like, I've got a really difficult day ahead of me. But tomorrow is going to be easier because I'll get through today somehow. So I think we're pretty much on time. I've got about 40 seconds. I'm missing an image here. I don't know where it's gone. Last thing I kind of want to say before we can take questions is, so I live in Valencia, I live in Spain. I don't know if anyone ever visits Spain, but we are just starting PyData Valencia. I really appreciate having the community here in London and also in Berlin. Thank you. Wasn't expecting that, but thank you very much. So we're just starting. I'm hoping our first meeting is going to be before the summer, before it gets super hot in Spain. So if anyone fancies a visit to Spain and wants to do a talk in Valencia, please let me know. And that's it. 30. Oh, there we go. There's the image. That's weird. That's it. 30 minutes exactly on the dot. That's all I got. Please connect with me. That's my LinkedIn. Very pleased to have conversations about this afterwards, either online or in the break area.